from the moment of conception, they considered the fetus their property. So they could put in a will that the future children of a Black enslaved woman belong to their heirs. They could gift to someone else or sign a contract of purchase for a fetus. And so even before a child was born, that child was owned by the person who enslaved the child's mother.
Dorothy Roberts, thank you for joining me on the podcast.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thanks for inviting me, Zach.
Of course, of course. So I wanted to start with your book, Killing the Black Body, which is, it's a fascinating, dark, and beautiful story that's weaved together in these pages. And you talk about the way that Black women's bodies have been controlled and abused throughout history. So I wanted to ask you, what is the source of this abuse and where did it start?
Well, the abuse of Black women's bodies starts from the moment that they were brought in chains to the so-called New World from Africa. Enslavement entailed essentially the control of Black women's reproductive labor because Black women bore the children who were considered chattel property of enslavers. And so that meant that because they had no legal rights, Black enslaved women at all, none, they were considered, again, chattel property of their so-called owners. They had no rights to their own bodies. And that included their reproductive capacity, that included their children, that included their sexuality. They could be raped with impunity. There was no concept of the rape of an enslaved woman because she had no right to consent or not to consent. She had no right to decide to have children or not to have children. She had no rights to a relationship with her children. And so that's the origin of the kind of violence against Black women that is rooted in a degrading notion, a devaluing notion of their sexuality and childbearing, especially.
So all of that control of their bodies and the reproductive control can be traced somewhere along the line back to when slavery started. There may have been some control leading up to slavery, but it wasn't at that level until chattel slavery really started.
I'm so sorry.
No, that's okay. It dings right before a good response. It lets you know that your brain is ready.
And I have my phone. Okay, let me shut my phone down altogether because I have it on airplane mode and I had do not disturb on. Okay, I'm very sorry.
No.
Right.
No.
I'll pick up from there. Well, the relationship between white people and Black women is rooted in enslavement because Europeans, shortly after they began to explore Africa, began to enslave African people. And so we could trace this earlier to the very beginning of the exploration of Europeans of other parts of the world. And that would be in the 1400s and the 1500s, 1600s. The settler colonialism and enslavement of Africans brought to the United States, of course, begins in the 1500s. I'm sorry. Settler colonialism in the United States and the enslavement of Africans begins in the 1600s. And African people were captured and brought to what is now the United States, the colonies, in the 1600s. And we see from the very beginning, the very first laws passed by the colonies in the United States had to do with the enslavement of Black people, and especially, and this is really critical, the control of Black women's reproduction. One of the first laws passed in the Virginia colony was a law asking, what is the status of children born to Negro women and fathered by Englishmen? These were white men. They were still called Englishmen because there was no United States yet. And these were white men who were raping African women, and African women were giving birth. And today we would say, of course, they were Black, these children. But at that time, the rules around race hadn't been established yet. And so this was a question. They should have been considered white. Their fathers were white. This was a patriarchal, highly patriarchal society. Yeah. But it was not in the interest of white enslavers to pass down their privileges and their inheritance to Black children, to children born to enslaved women. So they determined that these children should follow the status of their mothers and be considered Black and therefore enslavable. That's why Thomas Jefferson could rape Sally Hemings, whom he enslaved, and his children were considered Black, and he enslaved his own children, but they were not considered legally his children because of the rules of slavery, reproduction, and race. I think this is, for me, one of the most telling examples of how control of Black women's reproduction and race are so entangled in the very beginnings of what is now the United States, the 17th century colonies that became the United States.
Yeah. Yeah, I believe it was Kanye West that compared the contracts in the music industry to slave contracts or things that were happening during the time of slavery. And one of the biggest things that I learned in the book is the control of reproduction, the control of the children that Black women are having under slavery, that it's essentially anyone that comes from your gene pool, anything that you create, including human beings, is the property of the slave owner. And I'm not saying that slavery is in any way to the similar shape or form of the music industry, but when you were saying that, it reminded me of these horror story contracts that I hear musicians sign, and they're coerced into signing these pieces of paper that make them basically give away their entire life, their entire creative output without even realizing it. And it's in the fine print that, anything that you create for the next 20 years, any commercial you appear in, the percentage, all of these things, you think you're signing a 2-year contract and giving away a small slice of your earnings. And then you end up signing these 360 contracts where you're essentially not in full ownership of the things that you own. So when I first heard Kanye West say that, I was like, that seems like it's not related at all, an over exaggeration. And maybe it was, but as you were speaking, that popped into my head.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think it is the case that, of course, enslaving human beings is a unique kind of oppression of people, but slavery in the United States is so foundational to our institutions, our laws. You can find a lot of analogies to slavery in oppressive aspects of our society today. So I'm not surprised that Kanye would see this similarity, this resemblance between slavery and the way in which it allowed enslavers to control all of the production, right?
Yeah.
All of the production of enslaved people whom they owned. And you're right, that included their labor, what their physical labor, whether that was planting and harvesting and tilling crops, or whether it was other kinds of labor in the household, caring for white people's children and cleaning the house and all the other domestic labor, and also skilled labor. Black people who were brought from Africa, many of them were skilled in carpentry, and metalwork, and other kinds of important professions that their enslavers then could reap all the profits from. And so there is a similarity in what Kanye was observing about record companies taking the products of the labor of musicians and keeping the profits for themselves. By the way, I mentioned that what the colonists were doing was diverging from the patrilineal, patriarchal kinds of approaches to kinship that would have made these children born to Black women but fathered by them, right, heirs to white men. They did away with that, and what they adopted instead is a Roman rule, which is what Kanye is talking about, that basically says the pigs produced by a female sow belong to the owner of the sow. And so it's this Roman rule that you don't have control over the product of your own labor. Again, whether we're talking about reproductive labor and the children you bear, or the kinds of products that come from physical labor, it's the owner of you. And this, of course, is treating human beings like animals and applying a rule, not the rule of kinship that applies to families, but the rule that applies to owning animals. It's a deeply dehumanizing rule that was brought from Rome, into the colonies in the United States. And I think it is important to think about how these dehumanizing ideas that were put into law and culture and society during the slavery era continue to have effects on our society today.
Hey guys, this is a quick reminder that the two best ways you can support the show are by 1, leaving a rating and comment on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. This is like foreplay for the algorithm because it revs it up and makes our show appear higher in searches. And number 2, you can subscribe to Auxoro Premium at auxoro.supercast.com, where for $5 a month you get bonus episodes and more exclusive content. Thank you for however you choose to support the show. Yeah, it certainly seems like things like the music, some of the contracts in the music industry, and what you were talking about, the offspring of animals, the pigs, it seems like it could be a derivative of the slave mindset, the slavery mentality, even though it's nowhere close to the same level. It's a derivative of the way of thinking that essentially your offspring, whatever it is, your creative offspring, your animal offspring, ties back to the human element of offspring, to where you're under this binding contract. And if you get out of it, if you try to get out of it, you're going to be severely punished in some way, mentally, financially. Hard to get away with that physically nowadays, but I'm sure it still happens. But yeah, it's opening my eyes to see how many things are really tied back to that sort of mindset, which really didn't happen that long ago, a blink of an eye in terms of a historical standpoint.
Right. Well, not only did it not happen that long ago, but slavery existed in the United States for 400 years. So there was a long time for these ideas to be embedded in law, which some of these laws are still cited today in modern day contract cases. And, I haven't studied it, but look at what Kanye is talking about. It's possible that there's citations back to contract law from the slavery era. I wouldn't be surprised. Yeah. And Then we also have to remember that after slavery was abolished in the 1800s, there was a white supremacist backlash and effort to re-enslave Black people and reinstate white power, especially in the South, but also in the North. And Jim Crow was the regime until the 1960s. This is official racial segregation. So an official power given to white people, in the law. So yes, it's only very, very recently, in my lifetime. I don't know about you, Zach, you look pretty young, but in my lifetime,
I'm 28, turning 29. I'm 28, turning 29. Almost 30, I'm sorry to say.
Well, I was born before the civil rights movement victories, before the civil rights laws of the 1960s. And so these seem very recent to me. And of course, we're still struggling to actually put in place a democracy, a true democracy, true equality that was promised by the civil rights revolution that hasn't really happened. And in fact, as you know, we're living in a time where there's a big backlash now to even get rid of what advances were made. So you're right. Not only was slavery fairly recent, right? It was only abolished in the 1860s. And then it took 200 more years to, it took 100 more years. I'm putting too much time there. It took 100 more years even to get laws passed that guaranteed equality, and they haven't been enforced. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is the United States was a slave nation for most of its history, and then there were policies and laws and violence that sought to reinforce this kind of thinking, this racial thinking, afterward as well. So it's not long ago at all. It's recent history, and it's ongoing history.
Yeah, it's like it's a reverberation of slavery. Like when you throw a rock in the pond, slavery was that first big wave, but then you had things like Jim Crow that were these waves right behind it that, if you let things get steam again, it's possible that it picks up momentum, but luckily we're in a place where it doesn't look like that's going to happen. And I wanted to ask you, what was it like growing up during the civil rights movement as a Black woman? Were there any moments, any places that you either were or seeing happen unfold at the time that stand out to you when you think about that period?
Yeah, well, I'm not that old, Zach. I was an adult during the civil rights.
We're both almost 30. We're both.
No, I'm happy to say I'm 66 years old. I was born in 1956, which meant that I was an adolescent during the height of the civil rights movement. So I do remember it, but I was 11 years old when the civil rights, am I saying the right? That my math is not good, but when some of the civil rights laws were being passed, I was in elementary school, and I do remember that. I remember being very, very interested in the civil rights movement. By the way, I grew up in Hyde Park in Chicago, which was a pretty progressive place to grow up. My parents were very liberal. They weren't involved in the civil rights movement, but they were very liberal. My father was a professor, and his friends and my mother's friends were all, pretty left-wing liberal people. And I think was more interested in the civil rights movement and activism than even my parents, even as a young girl in Hyde Park. And I do remember going to meetings at a local church to keep on top of what was going on in the South and also in our neighborhood. and just being interested. I co-edited my elementary school newspaper, and
Mm.
so was interested at an early age. I would have been 12 years old at the time, in
Mm.
eighth grade, turning 13 while I was in eighth grade, and got to meet with John Johnson, who edited Ebony magazine and Jet magazine, which were the prominent Black media at the time.
Mm.
And his niece was in my class in Chicago. And so I had a keen interest in writing about social justice issues, and not participating so much because I was so young, but learning about and doing what I could to participate at that age. Certainly keeping on top of and having a keen
Mm.
interest in what was going on in the civil rights
Mm.
movement.
Hmm. I wasn't around at that time, obviously, but I can only imagine. I can only imagine that it's like the opposite of 9/11. Like if that makes sense. Like everyone's gathered around the TV, things are happening, big bills are being passed, like these huge moments in society, but it's for a good feeling. Like everyone feels good. They're like, oh shit, like I'm gonna remember where I was on this day. Like the day that this happened, this is gonna stay with me for the rest of my life. Is that kind of what it was like during that period where you had all these progressive things being passed and you're like, holy shit, I can't believe this is happening?
Yes, there was a general feeling, at least in my community, and I think this is true of many around the nation, that progress could be made, that there could be radical social change. I
Mm.
grew up with that feeling. And I think that's even, if I can't remember going to the South on a bus to protest, because I was too young to do that, and my parents
Mm.
weren't engaged in that. I suppose I could have gone along with them, but what
That
I
would have been
remember,
risky for a 9-year-old to
I
hop on the
think
bus and
so.
go down
I
there.
think so. But there were young Black kids who were
Yeah.
involved
Yeah.
actively in the civil rights movement in the South, who had fire hoses uh, uh, poured on them and that kind
Mm.
of thing.
Yeah.
In Birmingham, Alabama, for example, there was a protest by school children. So it's not unheard of that children were involved, but that wasn't my experience.
Yeah.
But my point is, my overall experience that I took from growing up in the 60s was that you could build a movement that would be successful in making radical change. It was a very uplifting, hopeful feeling that I think maybe I've felt uh, a couple times since then, but only a couple times with March for Women's Lives I participated in
Mm.
2004, I think it was, and then with the uprisings in summer 2020. But still nothing to compare with that feeling as a child during the civil rights movement of seeing victories, major victories in federal legislation, in changes in society, changes in thinking that occurred, and seeing massive protest across the South. Also, remember, there were protests against the Vietnam War going on at the same time as
Mm.
well, and seeing the war end largely as a result of the protests, of course, also as a result of the the loss by the U.S.
Yeah.
in Vietnam, but the protests also having a massive impact across the United States, and seeing this, on the news every night. Yeah, that was all very important to my upbringing, and I think my hopeful approach to social change today, despite all of the setbacks that we see.
Yeah. That's crazy that children were protesting during that time. I had no idea. The scariest thing that I would do as a kid in school is raise my hand. Like I was terrified to raise my hand or ask for an extra slice of turkey at lunch or something. So I couldn't imagine if all my other friends were like, yeah, let's go sit down in this diner and we might get sprayed by fire hoses that weigh just as much as we do. Like that's wild to me.
Yeah, yeah. Well, look into this history. At the name of the protest is escaping me, but it was a protest that was led by and included mainly, elementary and high school Black students in Birmingham, Alabama.
Mm,
And Bull Connor, brought out the police against them, but it had a major
mm.
impact.
I wanted to go back to the reproductive controls and ask specifically, you mentioned in the book unrestrained reproductive control of white slave owners over the female slaves. What did the reproductive control entail? What were the techniques? How is it being enforced? What were the actual things that were being done to these women to maintain the control over their bodies to take away those freedoms?
The main way in which enslavers controlled the bodies of Black women was simply to take ownership of their children. That was
Mm,
the main way that they considered, from the moment of conception, they considered the fetus their property. So they could put in a will that the future children of a Black enslaved woman belong to their heirs. They
mm,
could gift to someone else or sign a contract of purchase for a fetus. And
wow.
so uh, even before a child was born, that child was owned by the person who enslaved the child's mother.
Mm,
So that was, and then when the child was born, the child immediately, already was the property of enslavers, and enslavers could do whatever they wanted. They could sell that child off to somebody else.
mm,
They could do whatever they wanted to interfere with the relationship between Black parents and their children. Now, it was in the interests of enslavers for Black mothers to care for their children because they wanted
mm,
those children
yeah.
to grow up. Even before they grew up, they could already be put to work. They were put to work as children. And so that's the main way. But then they also engaged in various practices to prohibit Black women from not having children. So they could require that a Black woman who became pregnant bear that child.
Mm,
And so terminating a pregnancy would be against the wishes of an enslaver, and they could do what they wanted to. Now, Black women, there's historical records that Black women sometimes resisted this kind
mm,
of control by having abortions through various kinds of herbs and other kinds of methods.
yeah.
But
Yeah,
that,
I was gonna say if your only choice is to have a kid that's gonna be someone else's
right,
property, or to not have a kid at all, I would think that a lot of women would, if they were forced to get pregnant, then you would do whatever you could to not bring a child into that world. And I'm sure there's a lot of, there's sketchy abortions today. So I can only imagine the sketchiness and the danger of abortions back then, where you're,
yeah,
in a slave cabin with tools or herbs or whatever it is that they used. And I'm sure a lot of women died that way
yeah. Yeah, well, and also died during childbirth
during
because of
childbirth.
the
Yeah.
poor care that they got. So there's that as well. And then there is also evidence that enslavers engaged in what was called slave breeding, or what has been called slave breeding, that is matching enslaved women and enslaved men and requiring them to conceive children and bear children. I
Mm.
start my chapter on slavery in bondage with the story of an enslaved woman who was forced to live in a cabin with an enslaved man because the slave owner decided that they should be together and have children and force them to have children. And
Mm.
then also enslavers raping enslaved women, which they could do with impunity, legally. Again, Black women had no legal right to consent to sex or to refuse to have sex. And so, and because those children then were considered by law to have the status of the mother and considered to be owned by the enslaver from the moment of conception, they could then enslave those
Mm.
children, even
Mm.
though they were the biological fathers of the children. And we
Mm.
know that that happened all the time. Thomas Jefferson did it just as one prominent example, but it was common for enslavers to enslave their own children who were Black. And enslavers took careful notes, accounting for how many children each enslaved person had, encouraging by certain kinds of rewards those who had more children, punishing in various ways those who didn't have enough children. They could also sell off enslaved women who didn't produce the way they wanted
Mm.
to. So there were lots of means of both punishing the failure to have children and also coercing Black enslaved women to have children. And again, overall, having control over the pregnant bodies of Black women,
Mm.
as well as the fetus, as well as the child after they were born.
Mm. Were the mixed kids with the mixed slaves with a white father and a Black mother, were they given preference? Was there any sort of hierarchy, or were they all treated the same? If you're any percentage Black, you're a slave.
So they were, the idea back then, and of course, you have to think about this in the context of the 1600s.
Mm.
I think not the context of today. Today, we have rules that most people abide by in the United States that if you have any African ancestry, you're Black. You know, there's this rule that developed later, the so-called one drop rule, that was carefully managed and put into law in many states during the Jim Crow era, that if you had any drop, even one drop, so-called, of Black blood, because it's very unscientific, but this is how people thought, any drop of Black blood, you were Black.
So if I was alive during Jim Crow and it was found that I had a great grandfather who was Black, I would be considered Black, like with my Casper skin tone.
Yes, that's true. In fact, in the 1920s, there was this idea, and especially in Virginia, there was a whole system set up of racial classification and monitoring of people and their ancestry because of the concern that there were people passing as white who were really Black. And this is where the ban on interracial marriage that was held unconstitutional in 1967. This is a ban that was passed in 1924, and it was in place until 1967. So when you say this is recent, super recent, this is, when I was 11 years old. And by the way, my father is white and my mother is Black. So I have a personal relationship to this ban. When my parents were married, it was illegal
So yeah, your
in
parents broke the
16
law.
states. They got married in Chicago, or Evanston, Illinois. So it was legal, although taboo. In fact, when my parents
Yeah.
got married, the first church they went to refused to marry them in Evanston, Illinois, just outside of Chicago. But there was this fear that white people who were passing as white were really Black because they had some African ancestry, or what they would say then, some Black blood. And this is why this law was passed in 1924, the Racial Integrity Act, that not only banned interracial marriage, but it set up a whole system where all sorts of government agents, marriage clerks, and vital statistics, people kept vital statistics, doctors had to keep track of the race of everybody in Virginia. And you could not get married in Virginia unless you stated your race, and there was a crime to lie about your race. And
Yeah.
by the way, that law requiring that you state your race was in place until just a few years ago, when a group of couples who refused to state their race were denied marriage licenses in Virginia, and they sued, and they got a federal judge, to rule that it was unconstitutional. But that was only a few years ago.
Wow.
So this, again, as we've been saying, these ideas are embedded in law. We could trace them back to slavery, but they have been continuing. So
Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, we have gay marriage today. People marry themselves today. Like it's crazy that not that long ago that interracial marriage was against the law, and your parents, I'm sure, dealt with a lot of the repercussions of that. Even if they got married in a place where it was legal at the time, no doubt that they were going against the grain of what a lot of people saw as acceptable.
That's right. We lived in Hyde Park, which is a very liberal neighborhood, but other parts of Chicago, most of Chicago was very segregated. And I'm actually doing a research project on this right now. But, after the Great Migration, after World War I from the South, thousands and thousands of people, Black people, migrated, escaping Jim Crow in the South to Chicago. But in Chicago, they were heavily segregated into what was called the Black Belt. And if a white person married a Black person in Chicago at that time, they had to move into the Black Belt because they were not allowed. Black people were not allowed, for various means, racial covenants and violence and housing laws, to live in white areas. So this idea that if you have any African ancestry, you're Black, comes out of Jim Crow, where there was this extra effort to monitor the social engagements of Black people with white people, which wasn't so much on people's minds during slavery, the slavery era, because then Black people were enslaved. They did not have opportunities to go to school with white people. There was no marriage, legal marriage. Black people didn't have a legal right to marry during slavery, the slavery era. So initially, there was the idea of the mulatto. If you look at the first U.S. censuses in the 1700s, there was a category of mulatto that was those were people who had a Black parent and a white parent, mostly a white father and a Black mother. That has changed also over the centuries. Today, it's interracial marriages between Black people and white people are more likely to be a Black man and a white woman. But during the slavery era, so-called mulattoes were most likely to be children born to Black women who were the product of rape by white men, and which was not considered, again, legally rape. It wasn't considered a crime. And so we see these changes in racial classifications over the centuries that fit whatever the politics are at the time.
I wanted to switch gears a bit to the modern day birth control movement, and specifically how race affects reproductive freedom. So how does being a white woman versus a black woman affect the way that you have reproductive freedom in today's society?
To answer that, let me just say that from the time slavery ended until today, there have been massive efforts to regulate Black women's childbearing in a way that devalues their childbearing decisions. And that has included federally funded family planning and welfare programs that coerce Black women to be sterilized. So sterilization abuse has been a major experience of Black women beginning in the 1930s and all the way into the 1970s. And there's still examples of it today. But there is this long period in the 20th century where the idea that Black women were having too many children and that their childbearing was a social problem influenced social policy, including federal programs that led to mass sterilization of Black women. That is dramatically different from the experiences of white women whose childbearing has always been encouraged in the United States. So at the same time that Black women were being subjected to coerced sterilization, white women in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and to some extent even today, were finding it hard to get sterilized because doctors would say, oh, you're a young white woman, you should be having more children. And they have reported finding it difficult, being dissuaded from being sterilized. And social policy in the US has generally seen, especially middle-class white women, as the ideal reproducers of children. And we see today a growing sentiment among right-wing white people that their numbers, white people's numbers, are declining and that there are too many people of color in the United States. This has affected advocacy against immigration. It has affected the whole debate around abortion, which has always been tightly linked to policies encouraging white people to have more children, and the valuing of white women's childbearing versus the devaluing of Black women's childbearing. Now, all of this is oppressive. This is all about controlling people's reproductive lives and decisions, but it's based on a white supremacist, racist idea that Black women's childbearing is harmful and white women's childbearing is beneficial to society.
Yeah, that was the part of the book that shocked me the most, reading about the mass sterilizations that happened with Black women to prevent them from having children, and the way that drug use was treated differently when it comes to white women versus Black women for what that means for their kids. And for Black women, you talk a lot in the book about how it's a problem for them to have kids. It's a problem for a Black woman to have kids. And if they're on drugs, don't even think about it. Like, we're not bringing that person into society. And then if you have a white woman who is doing drugs, her kids aren't the problem, but she has a problem. Like, we need to get her help. It's not a problem for her offspring to come into society. She's the one with the problem, and she's fixable, and her right to having kids should not be completely taken away unless she demonstrates that she's not fit to have a child, but she at least gets the chance to have a child. So reading about the sterilizations and the crack baby epidemic, and I believe the line from the book was that crack babies were predicted to have a lack of social consciousness and just completely written off Black motherhood during that time. And if you happened to be a crack user, there was no chance that your kid was going to be anything in the world, and that you didn't deserve the chance to try to come back from a problem and raise a kid and get the help that you needed. That was something that was dark and enlightening to read about.
Yeah, you described it very well, Zach. That actually is the type of punishment of Black women's childbearing that brought me into the reproductive justice movement, actually at a time before reproductive justice was coined as a term in the late 1980s during the so-called crack epidemic, when I began to read about women being prosecuted for being pregnant and using drugs. And I began to document the race of these women and saw that it was almost entirely Black women who were being charged with crimes for using drugs while they were pregnant. And this was being fueled by a major media campaign about the so-called crack baby, with these articles saying things like, yes, so-called crack babies lack social consciousness, that they are going to be monsters. There's no hope for them. They're going to become criminals. They won't be able to be educated. They'll be welfare dependent. And this was the first time any child was described like that.
Yeah.
As if crack cocaine did something to a fetus to produce a particular kind of child who was always described as Black.
Yeah.
That was different from any other baby exposed to drugs. And also about their mothers, that their mothers, traded sex for crack, that they didn't care about their babies, that crack cocaine deprived them of maternal instinct. So they could not be good mothers. And those lies, those have been completely disproven by more recent research. And those kinds of stereotypes and lies about Black women, which followed on prior stereotypes about Black women, led to this campaign against them, which initially was almost exclusively against Black women. And you're absolutely right that although studies showed that white women were just as likely to use drugs while pregnant as Black women were treated completely differently. And we could see today, look at the difference in the government's approach to the crack epidemic and the opioid epidemic. With the crack epidemic, it was completely punitive. Put people in prison, including mothers who had just given birth to children, who were literally taken out of maternity wards and put in prison if their babies tested positive for crack cocaine. And think about the response to the opioid epidemic now, which is, as you said, opioid use is a problem, but it's the fault of other people, not the people using them.
Yeah, crack's like a permanent mark on your character, and opioid is a difficult hurdle that once you get through it, there's no after effects on how people view your autonomy or the way you walk through the world. It's like opioids is something you can regain control, and crack was like the mark of the devil. And I grew up in Long Island, which is the stereotypical, there's a lot of opioids in Long Island, but it's kind of the stereotypical suburban white Xanax popping wine mom, like that sort of, like the Real Lives of Long Island. If that was a show, like it'd literally just be moms drinking wine and popping Xans all day. And luckily my parents were not like that at all, but you never see any articles about what about these kids of these white wine moms. What are they going to be like? These moms that are addicted to opioids. You didn't really see that at all, or nearly as much, from what I could gather from the book, compared to the crack epidemic and the way that crack was viewed as having this level of gravity that completely altered the way you're able to handle yourself and handle raising a kid.
That's right. So crack cocaine is seen as something that completely destroys the ability of people to be valuable in society, including to raise healthy children, whereas the opioid use was seen from the very beginning as something that was put upon white people, that they were not to blame for using opioids. It was the drug companies. And look at how the government has responded now, which is to sue the drug companies that produced opioids and also the pharmacies that dispensed it, not so much to punish the people who are using opioids. And so there's a very, very different approach. Also, there isn't the stereotype about the monstrous opioid user as there is about the crack user. Like you said, using crack cocaine was seen as a permanent mark on someone's character. They were seen as completely devalued without any kind of redeeming qualities and should just be locked up. Whereas opioid users are seen as victims, to be sympathetic toward, victims of corporations that were interested in profiting off of them. And they can be redeemed, they can be rehabilitated. And it's a completely different view of these two sets of drug users.
Yeah, it's also interesting that you don't see the monstrous characterization of cocaine users as compared to crack, because they're essentially the same drug. Molecularly, they have, I believe it's the same structure or almost identical. And the characterization of a cocaine user is more like a high class finance bro, likes to party, goes out on the weekend. And if you tell someone you've done cocaine, it's like, yeah, who hasn't? Like if you live in New York City, live in an area where people are doing it, going out, music festival. And then if I told one of my friends that I smoked crack, I would have an intervention the next day. And it's the same drug, different medium. So it's interesting that the characterization falls in line, not necessarily with the drug, but with the stereotype of the drug user who is using it, which you can correct me on this, but I believe that crack use and marijuana use, in the past, it's been believed that there's an uneven distribution in the drug users who use it. So it's like more Black people may use crack or may use marijuana, but I believe it's actually the opposite, based on research, that there's actually more white crack users and more white marijuana smokers than people who smoke weed who are Black and smoke crack, use cocaine, things like that.
Well, that's probably true. I haven't seen the statistics on that, but it's probably true. I think it's certainly not true that Black people disproportionately use drugs, certainly not in the proportion by any means that they are arrested, prosecuted, and incarcerated for using drugs. And so, the underlying everything we've been talking about is the racism in the war on drugs. It
Mm,
is a war on Black people and Black communities, and Black people have suffered from astronomical rates of
mm,
incarceration, including the much higher penalty for distribution of crack cocaine compared to powder cocaine.
mm,
So, and that has had a disparate, dramatically disparate impact on incarceration rates. And also, you mentioned about how white parents using drugs and drinking alcohol isn't treated the same. And that is true also in terms of not just incarceration, but in the child welfare system and the approach of Child Protective Services
mm.
toward substance use. This is the subject of my latest book, Torn Apart,
Yeah.
that looks at racism in the child welfare system. And one of the main examples of that, or the most telling examples of that, is the way in which Child Protective Services treats drug use as if it is, by definition, a form of child maltreatment, and is much more likely to investigate Black parents, to accuse them of child maltreatment, to take their children away from them and put them in foster care because of alcohol or drug use than they are for white parents,
Mm.
especially middle class and wealthy white parents. It's such a stark, obvious form of racial discrimination when you have Black parents who are living in segregated, impoverished communities who routinely have their children taken from them,
Mm.
either because of drug use, or drug use is involved in the accusations against them. And then you have wealthy white parents who boast about using drugs. I've
Yeah.
seen actors on TV talk about it. I cite in my book blogs where parents are writing about drinking alcohol to make it through COVID, because they have their children at home. And so the stress of taking care of children, and they advocate drinking. And
Yeah.
they have no fear that their kids are going to be taken from them. So that's everything we've been talking about, these stereotypes that go back to the slavery era, the different ways that behavior by Black people, especially Black women, we've been talking about versus white women, all of these racial distinctions have a very serious impact on people's lives. I mean, we talked
Yeah.
about sterilization abuse, but also incarceration and having your kids taken from you is another life devastating
Yeah.
impact of this, both on Black mothers, but also on their children.
Yeah, it is such an essential freedom and a way to enjoy life, being able to do drugs and not have to worry about the repercussions and being able to do it in a safe way as an adult. All right, so technical difficulty, but we are back, and I was talking about the freedom of being able to do drugs and do them in a manner that's safe and fulfilling for you, which I believe any adult should have in any society. It's such a way to experience relief and have fun, and it's separate from the realities of day-to-day life. And something that I've never felt as a white guy is being afraid to do drugs, especially drugs that are illegal, like whether it's Molly or smoking weed before it became legal, or going to a place and having it on me in a state where I could go to jail. Like, it's literally not even a thought in my mind. I'll walk past a cop with a bag in my pocket, and there's like, I'll smile and get in the conversation, and I'm not, like, maybe a little bit of anxiety, but I don't think anything's gonna happen to me. And when I read about the way that Black people are locked up for doing the same drug at a rate that's so much higher than white people, it is such a, like, it's mainstream. Like people can see these numbers. It's almost like I'm in awe of how this is being approved and how this is able to happen in today's society, where we do have so much discussion around freedom and especially drug use, with things becoming more legal and people being much more out in the open, where, if you're black and smoke weed, you're something like 13 times more likely to go to jail than a white person who smokes weed. There's still a lot of black people that are rotting away in prison for low-level drug offenses, and they're in the same states where anyone could go to a weed bakery essentially and buy it. So it is another way of control where, alongside reproductive control, the drug control, to just experience the joys of life and to let go and to have the openness and the energy of, yeah, I'm going to do this and nothing's going to happen to me. It takes away a lot of enjoyment that you can get from a high, or being able to unload with your friends, or traveling and trying things at new places, knowing the fact that on paper, statistically, if you do this enough times, there's a good chance you might get caught and be treated vastly differently than one of your white friends. That is something that I've never felt the anxiety of, and it's mind blowing that it's still happening today.
Well, I commend you for admitting that, and that is a form of gross, obvious racial discrimination. I think there is this idea that Black people must deserve their higher rates of incarceration, and a failure to admit what's obvious, that this is just blatant racism, that Black people are locked up for things that white people do all the time. And this is something I point out about what I call the family policing system, the so-called child welfare system, that this idea that Black parents who have their children taken from them, that somehow they must deserve it, is just disingenuous. It's just ignoring the facts that there are many, many Black parents whose children are taken from them, mostly Black mothers, for the very same things that white mothers do. And again, especially if they're middle class, because this is a system that targets poor people in general. But drug use, whether we're talking about punishing Black mothers for being pregnant and using drugs, or having their children taken from them, drug testing in hospitals, police finding drugs in a home and calling CPS to take the children away, all of this, it's just so blatant that the war on drugs that is fought both in the criminal punishment system and the family policing system is a war on Black people. And I think it is important what you said about, not only does it put Black people in prison and take their children away, which are the most horrible deprivations of freedom and autonomy you can think of, but it also deprives Black people of the benefits of using drugs. Yeah. And that goes to another thing that you said that is rarely stated, is that there are benefits to using drugs. Yeah. Even saying that is anathema. I don't know if you've come across Carl Hart's book.
Yeah, Dr. Carl Hart at Columbia, yeah.
Yes. Okay. So I really admire him. I blurbed his book. Let's see my blurb on the back of his book. Yeah. And we've had a long association over the punishment that Black women experience for using drugs, for being pregnant and using drugs, and also having their children taken from them. And I really admire how he is willing to say this idea that drug use is always bad, that drugs are always addicting, that they ruin people's lives, is just false. It's false. But there's such a stigma around drug use, and then it's used in racist ways on top of it. So it's the combination of the stigma around drug use in addition to the racism that comes together to form this powerful way of oppressing Black communities that is, also combined with stereotypes about Black people as being prone to drug use. And by the way, that's one of the reasons why we see the opioid epidemic beginning in white communities, because it was marketed as a drug for white people. And Black people had a hard time getting prescriptions for painkillers, opioid painkillers, because of the stereotype that Black people are prone to drug addiction. And so you have a situation where opioids are being overprescribed to white people, based on a marketing campaign to white people. And then you've got Black people who are in pain and not able to get opioid treatment. You can read about the stories of Black people with sickle cell anemia who are told they cannot get pain treatment because they're seen as drug seekers.
Yeah.
I often cite a study that was done of Black children with severe pain from appendicitis, diagnosed appendicitis in the emergency room. And white children in the same situation were 3 times more likely to be prescribed opioid treatment than Black children. We're talking about little children in pain.
So in a way, poorly informed racial decisions by doctors may have saved a lot of Black people from the opioid epidemic, opioid crisis.
That's one way you can say it.
Yeah, the silver lining of racism.
I prefer to say point out the harms that it caused.
Yes.
And all the Black people who would have benefited from opioid painkillers who were denied it. That's really, because right now, guess what? And this is something also that you don't hear because of the differing stereotypes. The opioid epidemic is moving into Black communities. Now, you don't hear, white people are pushing the opioid epidemic into Black communities. Black people are the victims of white people. You never hear that.
Yeah.
You never hear that the opioid epidemic is because white people are genetically predisposed to drug addiction. But they'll say that about Black people.
Yeah.
So it's such, when you talk about drugs, it is such a telling example of how racist stereotypes about drugs, about poor people, all of these myths have caused such devastation. And I'm glad that you're bringing it up on your show because, and doing it in an honest way, because if you're honest about it, it's very obvious that wars on drugs are just ways to oppress people. They're not really about improving people's health. They're not really about fixing social problems. They're just manipulated to oppress the most disadvantaged people, and the most privileged people go on living their lives the way they want to. And the burden is then placed on the people who are most oppressed by race and gender and class hierarchies in this country.
Yeah, and going back to Carl Hart, I actually just finished Drug Use for Adults not too long ago, and I really appreciated the way that he explored his personal experiences with drugs and the way that he spoke about choosing to enter different realities. And those weren't his exact words. I'm paraphrasing the effect that it had on me, but it made me think about something that I had always suspected since I was a teenager, was that the vast majority of people who are drug users will never have a problem with that drug. That's not to say they're not dangerous and it shouldn't be shouldn't be not monitored, but just come with certain guidelines, precautions, approach it with a safe attitude. But the vast majority of people are never going to have severe problems with their drug use. They're never going to become an addict. And that when you take a drug, you are taking something that opens a door to a different type of reality, a different mind state. And that should be used to enhance your life. And that's the way that I choose to approach it, that taking a drug is something that I'm going to use for the next hours, or if it may be close to a day, depending on what you're taking, if it's something more psychedelic. But it's you're opening a door to a reality that you believe is going to help you in some way. It's going to enhance the experience, whether it's taking LSD or having a couple drinks with friends. That thing is running through your body, and it is making that experience better for both parties and for yourself. And it's a weird sort of control to want to have over people, because when someone else is choosing to take a drug and they're not causing any problems for anyone else there, they're just having an experience, that in no way deters you from leaving, or it doesn't make the experience different than you choose to have. It doesn't alter your reality in any way. So it's like you're trying to control someone else from operating in a way that doesn't affect you at all, which is why the freedoms taken away with drug use have always struck me as so like draconian and weird. And it's like a sick type of power that you would want to take away from someone, to be able to have an experience that is not harming you or anyone else at all when you're an adult, because adults are able to make informed decisions and choose to take a drug and choose to go there should they, or not choose. And when someone else says that, you can't do this or you can't do that, you can't take this drug, you have to do this how I say, it's a reflection of how they view themselves and not necessarily a reflection of how they view your drug use. It's revealing a problem that they are battling internally. Maybe they came from an upbringing where that drug was seen as a mark of permanent instability. And I came from a Catholic household, and my parents, although they're more open to drug use now, I came from a place where, weed ends you up in the hospital. Like, you have constant panic attacks. Like, don't do it. I had that one story from my dad that was like, I smoked weed once and my friends had to tie me to a tree, and I wanted to take them to I wanted them to take me to a hospital and they refused. And like, that cycle of stories running throughout my head. And then I went off to college and I tried various drugs, and I found that I had a lot of friends that used drugs, and I've used drugs myself, that also turned out to be great fathers now. I have a lot of my friends are having kids, great at their jobs, amazing friends, and that a drug should really be seen as a choice and something simple, like choosing a type of workout, choosing a type of diet. Like, if you're someone who chooses to engage in an activity that is not harming anyone and it's actually enhancing your experience, then why would we want to take that away from people?
I think you hit the nail on the head when you said it's about control.
Yeah.
Now, my approach as a legal scholar and a sociologist is to look at the social and political implications of it. So I would stress that it is a way for people in power to have control over
Mm,
marginalized people, especially. While many of them are engaged, in the same kind of behaviors, but they
yeah.
stigmatize it when somebody else does it, especially along race and class lines. And again, it's been a major way of imposing racial oppression and control through locking people up and taking their children away. And there isn't enough honest, critical thinking about the truth of drugs and the benefits and as you said, the lack of harm that they
Mm,
cause. It's
yeah.
just a way, it's an excuse, a really powerful excuse, though. I mean, the stereotypes about drug use are so powerful. So many people believe them and are, I think our conversation, they would be shocked. Oh my goodness, how could you say that? I'm sure lots of people are shocked by Dr. Hart's book, but it's backed up by evidence, and it's just not true that if you use drugs, you are by definition a bad parent. And
Mm,
yet that is a common perception in child protective services.
yeah.
And again, it maps onto racist stereotypes about Black people to begin with, and you put the two together, and it just forms a really powerful way of controlling people.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you about a system that's going to become either a problem or something that hopefully will enhance the future. Who knows? But CRISPR and gene editing when it comes to reproduction. What are your thoughts on gene editing when it comes to applying that to children?
Yeah, and I'm glad you focused on reproduction because there's a difference between gene editing that's a one time, we're going to go in and fix a gene in an individual that is causing some health problem,
Hmm.
and changing the genome of somebody so that they reproduce children, and those children reproduce children that have a changed genetic structure.
Mm,
Um, in other words, the gene is eliminated for generations to come. And I oppose gene editing for reproductive purposes, or at least, I mean, I do oppose it. At least I think we need to have a more robust, diverse, open discussion about the ethics of it before anyone engages in it, although there have already been attempts to do it. And that's because the idea behind it is that there are certain genetic defects that should
mm,
not be in the human species, that we should not pass on to children. And that idea that there are certain genetic defects that should not be passed on has been used in terrible ways in the past. And again, not that distant past. Eugenics was an era in the United States that lasted from the turn of the 20th century to World War II, as official mainstream science and government policy that supported mandated sterilization of thousands and thousands of people in the United States because they were predicted to have defective children because of some innate genetic trait that they had. And so we have a history of controlling and punishing people because of their either presumed or tested genetic traits. And we also have a society that has deep inequalities. It has discrimination against people with disabilities, profound discrimination against people with disabilities, as well as other kinds of deep inequalities. And I don't want gene editing to be seen as a fix for disability or other kinds of disadvantages that people have in our society. And we know that genetics has been seen as a fix for social changes that are needed. And so, what I call for is that before it's approved to engage in reproductive gene editing, that we have a real ethical discussion that includes people with disabilities, that includes people from various social positions that have a stake in social change. as opposed to a stake in fixing genes.
Yeah.
Some people have said that a concern with gene editing is that only wealthy people will be able to engage in it, and then we'll have this group of wealthy people that
kind of like a super race.
Right, a super race of people. Now that could happen, kind of Gattaca kind of sci-fi, which could happen. My concern is actually somewhat different. Because I think that people could be forced to engage in gene editing if they're predicted to have genes that society doesn't want, that are devalued in society. And I think it's just as bad to force gene editing based on some standard of what children should be like. And look at the stories about gene editing. They tend to have pictures of these white, blue-eyed, blonde-haired babies that was some sign that they're really intelligent. And then there's some caption like, "Don't you want a baby like this?" Or, gene editing could produce. There's this idea that we have of what is the perfect baby. The question of what gene should be edited out is a value-laden question. And I think we need to really, again, be honest about what are the standards in our society of which genes are considered good and which genes are considered bad before we start modifying people's genetic makeup to produce perfect children.
It's a really tough line to draw, because if you're modifying your unborn child's genes, you are essentially saying that this is a defection. Like you said, this is a gene that we do not running through society. So if I'm having a son or a daughter and the doctor walks in and says, "Hey, technology's so good nowadays. Your wife has been pregnant for 3 weeks and we can already see the scan of your child's entire life outlook. Like, this is the trajectory of their life. And, they're going to be born without being able to walk. They're going to be, quadriplegic is all four, or is it paraplegic? They're going to be unable to walk, so they won't have use of their legs. As a parent, I'm like, obviously I want to edit that out. Like, I don't want my child to have to go through life walking or not walking. But then you also have a lot of people who can't use their legs that are also beautiful people in society that contribute amazing technologies and ideas. And so it's like, you're saying, I don't want that in my child, even though I know they can still be an amazing person. But then you have things like autism or Down syndrome, where it's like your doctor says, yeah, they're going to be born autistic. Do you want this to come out? And it's like, well, maybe your brother's autistic and he's a great person and he hasn't really had that many problems with it, or maybe he's more severely autistic. There's like an entire spectrum. So I don't know. It's like it's a tough thing to regulate, and I don't know if there's a solid line of these things should be allowed to be edited and these things shouldn't. And then even things like just height, like if the doctor is like, your son's gonna be 5'2", like, do you want him to be taller? I'd be like, yeah. I mean, there are a lot of problems in the dating world that come with, trying to date as a 5'2" guy. Like, let's crank the dial up a little bit to like 5'9", 5'10". And then once you're at 5'10", the doctor's like, well, do you want to just round up to 6? And I'm like, yeah. And he's like, do you want him to have some more lean muscle, like all this stuff? So it's like, where do you stop? I feel like it's like when you become obsessed with your income, it's like, okay, you got to raise, and you said your dream was to always make $100,000 a year. And then all of a sudden the next promotion is 150. And then it's like, okay, now my life has adjusted to that. And now I want 400. I feel like it's a similar type of feeling where once you start making these edits and you get the, the menu, the doctor comes in and he's just like, check off these boxes for whatever you want. Like a reproductive Chipotle or something, where you're just like making your kid like you make a bowl. Where do you draw the line? Like, where I don't think right now we have the means to do that ethically as a society. If that started today, I think it would be a complete shit show. But hopefully in the future, we'll have some more clarity on what the way is to do that in a, fulfilling, positive manner. And I have no clue. People much smarter than me will be working on that. Luckily.
The thing is, the people who are working on it are also the most privileged kinds of people in our society. So, and they have subjective values about what is valuable and what isn't. So, I think you're right, Zach. That's one of the issues that has to be hashed out. What are the genes that are considered valuable and which ones are devalued? That's one question, and it's not just a universally answered neutral kind of question. It's deeply embedded with values. We've been talking about this the whole time, about whose childbearing is valued and whose childbearing isn't. What about the color of skin? Should that be part of it as well? And then the other is that it also assumes that the child's life will be controlled by their genes. It doesn't take into account how society and social structures, social inequality, the freedoms that we've been talking about and how freedoms are controlled, how all of that affects children's lives as well. And that's one of my concerns, is the focus on changing genes as the answer to social problems, instead of focusing on all of the societal changes we need to make in order to have equality and humanity and people's flourishing of people's lives. And we can see this with disability, where for some people the answer is, well, just edit out the gene that produces a disability. And of course, that's a subjective question too. What is a disability that should be edited out? But even apart from that, a major reason why people with disabilities are not flourishing to their capacity in our society is because there's stigma against disability. There's devaluation of people with disabilities. There's concrete forms of discrimination against people with disabilities. There's our society, even in its physical structure, isn't shaped and built in a way that takes into account disability. So, what about the people with disabilities today? When we're talking about editing them out, what does that mean? So all of these, there aren't easy answers. And I don't think it's just a matter of being smart enough to answer them. I think we need people from all different social positions to be part of it, because your social position makes a difference to how you value these things.
Yeah, and we already have a little bit of a looking glass into how something like gene editing will play out. A program to edit something that will affect billions of people. When you take autopilot with Tesla, for example, you have a very small number of engineers that are deciding the decisions that your car will make, which eventually will be the decisions that billions of people will have to deal with in the future, where something like, a truck slides in front of you at an intersection and the car can swerve. And if it swerves 40 degrees, you hit an old man. But if it swerves 45 degrees, you hit two children. And if it swerves, 55 degrees, like you hit a pole, but you die. So it's like, what is the editing in that case going to be in favor of? Is it going to be in favor of killing someone who's older? Is it going to be in favor of protecting your life? Or is it going to be in favor of doing the least damage overall, which might be taking the driver's life? And to be honest, I don't want a car that's going to, as a selfish human being, I don't want the first option to be, if it has to kill me, it drives off the cliff instead of, maybe hitting someone else and killing them. And that's a very dark thought to have. But as a selfish person and a human being who wants to survive, that's the type of things I'll ask before buying a car when it comes to that. Like, if that situation happens, like, am I going to be the one that the car is thinking about, or is it going to be thinking about like total life? And then the same thing, if for gene editing, there's going to be a very small number of people, probably tech people somewhere like Silicon Valley, that are making decisions behind closed doors to how these edits are going to play out to have an impact on billions of people's lives. And then the technology will just kind of roll out and we'll have choices within that. But in terms of how the technology is created and all the inputs that go into it, there won't be much of a selection from your average person.
That's a very good point. And again, viewing it as a legal scholar and sociologist, I look at what are the societal implications of what you just said. So first of all, who are the people who can afford those cars? They're going to be more privileged than the people walking around probably who can't afford them. And so the probably inputted into this is the valuing of those people who can afford the cars. And so that personal decision, oh, I want a car that's going to kill people on the streets and not me, is going to privilege people who can afford the self-driving car. And then also, I have been studying, as have other people, the way in which racial bias is embedded into artificial intelligence, predictive analytics, other kinds of technologies that are being developed now. There's been more and more research showing how the algorithms themselves and the databases that they are run through embed racism within them. An example is police predictive analytics, where police departments are increasingly figuring out, which neighborhoods called hotspots do we put the most police officers in, because we can predict crimes are going to occur there. Well, the databases are based on arrests of people which are racially biased, as we've been talking about already. And so the prediction is that, the crime is going to occur in Black neighborhoods. So they send more police officers there, arrest more people there. And then they say, look, the predictions were accurate because that is where we found crime, because of the original loop back that was started by the bias data to begin with. And there's so many ways in which we see that. So even in your example of the self-driving car, you could imagine that something goes into the algorithm where dark skin is put in, or the model of the person who should be avoided from being hit is a white person. And, we already see this in facial recognition technology, other kinds of technologies where racial bias has been shown to be embedded in algorithms where the technicians, the people who develop them say, we don't have racial bias. But when there are unconscious biases and there is structural bias that's built into the database itself, and that then produces these discriminatory outcomes. So I think your example of self-driving cars is apt. And we see other examples like that where the small group of people who have control, and by the way, they have proprietary control. Even in government systems that use these predictive analytics, the companies that produce the algorithms have trademarks and other kinds of proprietary rights. Sometimes they don't even reveal it to the governments that are then implementing, their analytics. So
that's a great terrifying point, that if you're in a self-driving car and you have two options, to swerve and hit a white guy that's 32 years old with two kids, and swerve and hit a Black guy who's 32 years old with two kids. That car, assuming there's no third option, will make a decision, and the decision's gonna and the decision's gonna be based on something, and that's all gonna happen in nanoseconds. So is the car gonna pull up like past criminal records, or like likelihood of something, or like any like who's made more money, who it views
Yeah.
as who's gonna be the better asset to society. Like that's all gonna happen in 0.0002 seconds,
Yes.
and the decision is gonna be programmed in by humans.
Yes.
So it's a very dark thing to think about. That what are the types of things that are gonna go into whose life deserves to not be ended right now.
Absolutely, absolutely, and people might think, "Oh, that's absurd. That's science fiction. That's never going to happen." Read books that are Sophia Noble's book on algorithms of oppression, other books that have been written about how the weapons of math destruction. There are studies that have been done, books that have been written that show how decisions like the one you just described are already being made and programmed into algorithms and databases. So it's not science fiction, it's happening already.
Yeah. I want to get into your most recent book, Torn Apart: How the Child
Mhm.
Welfare System Destroys Black Families. And the story of Vanessa Peoples specifically, I think that's kind of a good entering point that will draw people into the book in its entirety. Can you tell the story of Vanessa Peoples and what happened to her?
Sure. Vanessa Peoples was a young mother with two children who was undergoing a lot of health issues. She had anemia. She was being tested for leukemia while she was a nursing student in Aurora, Colorado. And she went to a family picnic one day, enjoying herself, when her youngest child, a toddler, strayed away from the picnic, following her cousin out to a parking lot. And Vanessa noticed. She grabbed her older son and ran after him. But in the minute it took for her to catch up, she noticed that a stranger had grabbed her little boy and was on the phone. And when she got there, she discovered that the stranger had called the police to report that this child was in the parking lot. Vanessa and the stranger would not give her son back. So Vanessa, who
Was
was
this stranger's name Karen?
I don't have the stranger's name, but
Yeah.
she was a Karen type. Let's put it
Yeah.
that way.
Yeah.
And the police officer arrived. What Vanessa had to get her family there to vouch for her, got her son back, but the police officer issued her a ticket for child endangerment and abuse. And then a month later, a white caseworker shows up at her door, knocks on the door, because what happens when you get charged with any kind of child maltreatment, the Child Protective Services has you on their radar and they're going to come and investigate you. So this caseworker had shown up with an intern trainee, and she knocked on the door. Vanessa didn't hear. She was down in the basement. She's also hard of hearing in one ear. And the caseworker could see that her son was in the window of the first floor. And instead of just going away and coming back another time, or maybe calling Vanessa on the phone, she called the police. And three police officers arrived. They entered Vanessa's home, one with a gun drawn, and met Vanessa coming up
Jesus.
from the basement. Vanessa says, "You see, my children are fine. Please leave." They refuse to leave. They begin interrogating her. One police officer starts going around her house, looking into the refrigerator, into kitchen cabinets, into drawers. And they begin interrogating her about the welfare of her children as she's telling them to leave. Won't leave. She calls her mother to come home and help her. Her mother arrives and takes the two young boys into the bedroom to be away from these police officers and to get them dressed and ready for the day. And a police officer insists that she cannot be in the room with her grandchildren by herself. She has to be monitored by the police. Now, mind you, this woman has done nothing wrong. She's in her own home, right? And they're calling more police to come in for backup. Eventually, 7 police officers arrive at the home. Vanessa begins to yell at them to leave her mother alone and let her come in where her children are. And one of the police officers, and this, by the way, is all on their body cam. I've watched the tape several times, and that's the basis for this story. A police officer grabs her by the neck and shoves her down onto a beanbag that was a chair that was on the ground. Two other police officers join him in hog tying her, forcibly jerking her arms behind her, dislocating her shoulder, and handcuffing her, chaining her legs and chaining her arms and legs together, and carry her upside down outside her house into a police car. She spends 30 minutes hogtied in this painful position before they finally call an ambulance to take her to the hospital. And she's at the hospital. They treat her with ibuprofen and a sling, and send her off to jail. Her mother bails her out that night, but now her nightmare isn't over. She is now under the watch of Child Protective Services, what I call family policing, because as you can see, this is a violent way of supposedly caring for children that involves accusing parents, invading their homes, searching them, investigating them, often bringing police officers along, especially in Black neighborhoods, and terrorizing families. Vanessa is still, a couple years later, suffering from the aftermath of this. She did go through all the requirements they put on her: supervised visits, unannounced visits with at her home to monitor her parenting of her children. She had to go to parent training classes, all sorts of classes, and psychological evaluations. And this is the kind of thing they put on parents. She finally got out from under that, but her name is now in a child abuse registry in Colorado. Again, for allowing her child, which happens all the time, any parent will know this, to traipse away for a minute. She cannot practice nursing. She finally got her nursing degree, but after this trauma, but she cannot practice nursing now because she's on this child abuse hotline. She hasn't been able to get an apartment because landlords look her up and see that she's on this child abuse registry and refuse to rent to her. She's limited in the job options she can have because there are a lot of jobs that are prohibited for people who are on this registry. And so her life has been turned upside down, supposedly to protect her children from her.
Yeah, because her kid was in a window while she was working downstairs, which is so bizarre that besides the terrorizing part of it, it's so bizarre that this social worker, who has no doubt seen escalatory situations where a kid is actually being abused, that she would see a kid just playing in a window or something and a light goes off in her head. To not only is that a sign of possible abuse, but I need to call the cops, and then those cops need to call 5 more cops, and then she's being hogtied like a pig in the back of a police car. And how are all those charges and the restrictions not dropped immediately once the body cam footage came out? Like, if you could see all of this on camera, how is the judge just not like, this is so fucked, like, we're sorry, here's a bunch of money, like, that cop is like, have there been any repercussions whatsoever for the social worker or the police officers?
So Vanessa did obtain a lawyer and sue, and she did get a settlement from the city of Aurora, but no direct repercussions on the police officers who injured her for no reason at all. And also, her name hasn't been removed from this child abuse registry. She still had to go through a year of monitoring by not only probation, but also the child welfare department. So, you could say, well, why hasn't anything been done? But what happened to her happens to thousands and thousands of Black parents disproportionately. Also, white families, Native families are also, along with Black families, the most likely to undergo investigation and disruption like this. But this is how the child welfare system operates in general. Most of the children who are taken from their homes and put in foster care are taken on grounds of neglect, not child abuse or either physical or sexual abuse. The vast majority of children are taken because their parents are accused of not meeting their needs. And so this is really a system that targets impoverished families and disproportionately Black and Native families for this kind of what I call terror and trauma to families that doesn't meet their needs and just makes their situations worse off, and then puts thousands and thousands of children, there are over 400,000 children now in foster care, and hundreds of thousands of children taken every year from their families and put in foster care, which we know, it's well documented, that children in foster care suffer from all sorts of problems from being in foster care because of the trauma being taken from your family. Often they're moved from place to place. Their education is disrupted, their healthcare is disrupted, their social relationships are disrupted, and they're also more likely to be put in juvenile detention and eventually to go to prison because of their involvement in foster care. So it's a very damaging system, again, especially for Black children and Native children in this nation.
As we end off, I wanted to ask you about something we could probably do another 2-hour podcast on, but we'll try to do it in a few minutes. So in June of 2022, the Supreme Court voted to overturn Roe v. Wade, making abortion illegal or severely limited in, I think it's nearly half the U.S. at this point. What does this decision by the Supreme Court mean for the bodies of women and the bodies of Black women in particular when it comes to reproductive freedom?
The Dobbs decision, which allows states to ban abortion, and as you said, about half of states either have already or will ban or severely restrict abortion, making it pretty much inaccessible to people in the state, has a tremendous impact on everyone in the nation, really, because it allows states to compel people to give birth, which means that people in those states will be forced to give birth or will flee to free states, which will also be affected then by this influx of people trying to get abortions. And this will have the greatest impact on Black women, who are the most likely of any people in this country to seek abortions. And also because Black women have the highest rate of maternal mortality. That means deaths resulting from pregnancy-related causes. And childbirth is more dangerous for Black women than any other women in this nation. In fact, childbirth is more dangerous for a Black woman in the Mississippi Delta than it is for a Black woman in Rwanda or Kenya. We have alarming rates of deaths from pregnancy-related causes in the United States.
Is that lack of healthcare, or what would make the risk so much higher in a place in the U.S. as opposed to somewhere in Rwanda?
It is dangerous for Black women partly because of lack of healthcare in terms of prenatal care and obstetrical care, but also because of poor health in general. Black women have poor health because of inequities in our healthcare system. That's both inadequate access to high quality health care, but also living in conditions that aren't good for your health. Poverty is not good for your health. Stressful jobs are not good for your
Yeah.
health. In the South, a lot of Black women either are unemployed or they work in factories and of various sorts that are very stressful. They experience high rates of racism, direct racial discrimination. That's stressful on your health. There's segregated housing that's inadequate and dangerous. Also proximity to toxic waste. All of these conditions that Black women are more likely to experience that are bad for your health, that also make pregnancies more dangerous. And so the banning of abortion means that Black women who have dangerous pregnancies are going to be less able to terminate them. This is something that I think many people may not realize, that there are health reasons to terminate a pregnancy, and doctors who are practicing in places that make it a crime for them to perform an abortion, unless it's to save the life of the mother. And hopefully there will at least be that exception to the ban.
Yeah,
although we don't know. We don't
Yeah.
know. I mean, there may be places that will pass laws that say even if the pregnancy will kill the pregnant person, you cannot, it's a crime to perform it. But let's say there's an exception for life. The doctor now has to decide, how close to death does my patient have to be before I can save her life without being prosecuted for a crime? I mean, just saying that to me shows the kind of brutality, the uncivilized nature of politics in America today, that we would have doctors having to ask, how long do I have to wait to save someone's life before I will be prosecuted for a crime for trying to save my patient's life? How devalued are women and pregnant people in this nation? So there's that on top of the burden on people who have decided, I can't afford to have a child for whatever reason.
Yeah.
Whether it's whatever situation I'm in, I cannot afford to have a child now. I need to terminate this pregnancy, and being forced to give birth. The pressure on that family is unhealthy. It's a lack of freedom. I mean, I've been emphasizing the health effects, but it's in general a lack of freedom, a denial of basic human rights and freedom to force people to carry a pregnancy to term. That by itself is a violation of human rights.
And in a way, I don't know, go ahead.
But then the consequences of it as well. The whole thing is so abominable. It's just unimaginable that a nation that calls itself, free and equal would have a set of laws like this that compel people to give birth.
Yeah. And in a way, it goes back to the drug conversation, because if you have something like abortion that people are going to seek out regardless, if someone wants an abortion for whatever reason, they're usually going to be, pretty determined to get the desired outcome. And by banning that service that's required to get to that outcome, you're not getting rid of abortions. You're just making it more unsafe. You're making it more expensive. You're putting all these restrictions on it that in the end are not getting to the desired outcomes that you want, which is getting abortions to zero for the people that voted for this. But you're just making more unsafe abortions. You're just hurting the people who are seeking it out, just like drugs, where if you make a drug illegal, like the drug war has been going on forever, and more drugs pour into the US every year. You don't have any testing. You don't have safe places to purchase these drugs for almost every drug except marijuana. Like there's a lot of dangerous activity that happens when you just put an all-out ban on something, and it doesn't get to the outcome. It makes you further away from the outcome that both parties would want. The party that wants to limit abortions and the party that wants a safer, more economic alternative. It doesn't make sense either way.
It doesn't make sense unless you go back to what we were saying
Yeah,
before.
exactly.
The real objective is control. The
Yeah.
real objective is control and punishment. And it does do that. It increases the control, it
Hmm.
reduces the freedom, and it punishes the people who are going to be the ones that carry the burden of these kinds of laws. And that's why, we have to continue to oppose them while we're building up a more free and truly safe and healthy society.
Yes. And thank you for bringing it back to that. That's a perfect place to end off. And thank you, Dorothy Roberts. This was like I said at the beginning, it's a beautiful but also dark conversation to have, but a necessary trip into the void of darkness to be able to understand that things happen like this and how they're happening. Before we end off, can you please plug anything, including the books, website, and I will link everything in the description of the podcast for people listening, whether they're watching on YouTube or Spotify, Apple.
Sure. Well, I will definitely plug my books, Killing the Black Body, Race,
Yep.
Reproduction, and the Meaning of Liberty, which
Got
you
it right here.
showed.
Yep.
I also have a book that's relevant, Fatal Invention, How Science, Politics, and Big Business Recreate Race in the 21st Century, which is about the continuing myth that human beings are naturally divided into races, which is at the bottom of a lot of what we talked about. And then my most recent book, Torn Apart, How the Child Welfare System Destroys Black Families and How Abolition Can Build a Safer World. I do have a website. I haven't updated it. It's a little crappy,
Yeah.
but it's Dorothy E. Roberts. And that is also my Twitter handle. I'm better at keeping up with Twitter, which is at Dorothy E. Roberts.
Got it.
So people can follow me that way as well.
Yeah, you guys can check that out. And thank you again. This truly was a blast.
Thanks a lot, Zach. I appreciate your questions and your very insightful comments. You're smarter than you think you are.
We'll see. We'll tell it to my mom.